Pilots from both sides took their aircraft above the battlefield, not just to bombard it or strafe it with machine gun fire, but to photograph it. That unique bird's eye view of the Great War. What does it tell us, and how does it relate to the landscape of the Western Front today? The reality of warfare is something that's almost impossible to escape at the moment. Not just on a daily but almost hourly basis we see depictions of the battlefield, particularly from above with shots from drones, that bring home just how grim warfare is. More than a century ago in the Great War there were no drones, but the aerial depiction of the battlefield from aerial photographs was very much an important part of both sides' understanding of what the battlefield was, where it was, and how they could fight over it. I first came across aerial photographs in some of the earliest books that I read about the First World War, and then when I began to collect photographs and militaria connected to the Great War, I went to a militaria show in Surrey one weekend and picked up a pile of German aerial photographs from the Battle of Verdun in 1916. These were so clear that I could even see human beings on them, columns of Frenchmen marching down a road, the sun glinting off the steel helmets of soldiers in frontline trenches. To me this was extraordinary. These were not just photographs showing the intelligence makeup of an enemy's defences. Much more than that, they depicted the landscape of the Western Front in a way that I hadn't really truly understood, and when I began to visit it on a regular basis, to connect up what I could see in air photos like this with the landscape as it is today became an important part in my understanding of what the Western Front was about, and indeed any battlefield of the First World War. Aerial photography was cutting-edge technology in the First World War, but how did this come about, and how did it become to be such an important part of military intelligence in that conflict? The first known air photographs were taken from a balloon in France in 1858, and the first major military use of aerial photography in a war was during the American Civil War in 1862 during the Siege of Richmond in Virginia. A gridded map air photograph was compiled, made from a series of photographs taken from a balloon. Again, this is pre-aircraft technology, and they were used to direct artillery fire. The information compiled from the making of the photographs gave the commanders of those artillery units a better understanding of where the enemy positions were, where the enemy troops were located, and they could more effectively direct their guns onto the target. When we look back at the American Civil War, there are a lot of parallels with the First World War. I often think of it as, in some respects, the First Great War, because with the use of air photographs like this, barbed wire, trenches, mining, and so many other aspects, we see in the war between the states echoes of what was to come just over half a century later on the Western Front during the Great War, but that's a tale perhaps for another day. But with the arrival of the ability to produce and use balloons, not just in civil life but on the battlefield as well, the British Army soon used them as well, and balloon sections of the British Army were established in 1879 and were used for the first time in the fighting in the Sudan in 1884 to 85. The Royal Engineers were the ones that took up the use and implementation of balloons on the battlefield, and the role and use of balloons was observation, was to spy on the enemy, to get up high, to look down onto the enemy positions and troop movements, and make decisions based on actual intelligence where you could see the movement of an enemy, which in previous conflicts where the view was very much at ground level was often almost impossible. So this bird's eye view became such an important part of commanders' understandings of how to make their decisions in the midst of a battle. And taking cameras up into the relatively static atmosphere of a balloon, it's not moving about too much, it was quite easy to use cameras to make a record of what you were seeing, so that could then be conveyed to staff and commanders on the ground. And during the Boer War, you see the first use of this by the British Army. There are photographs, for example, that show a British encampment with shells, Boer shells landing on it, and there were images like this taken during that period. But their true value, I think, at that stage was not entirely realised. As the army moved from the Boer War into the Edwardian period, it was moving towards a philosophy of a war of movement. Pretty much every army in Europe at that time was. And perhaps the static ability of balloons and their limitations in that respect were not seen as part of the philosophy of war at that time. But nevertheless, the balloon sections of the Royal Engineers continued. But the game changer really was the move from balloons to aircraft and the development of aircraft technology. And in 1912, within the British Army, the establishment of the Royal Flying Corps. The Royal Flying Corps, or the RFC, was not a separate organisation. It was part of the British Army at that stage. And its aircraft were small and limited in their capacity. They were not armed, and they were there in a reconnaissance role. So when Britain went to war in August 1914, the pilots, the pioneer pilots of the RFC, were not there to engage with the enemy in aerial combat over the battlefield. They were the eyes of the British Expeditionary Force, flying over the ground in France and Flanders and spotting troop movements. The RFC didn't go to war with its own cameras as such. Many of the pilots had experimented with cameras before the war, and some took private cameras with them, but at that stage there was no official use of cameras to record what was on the ground. Nevertheless, the first occasion in which an RFC pilot used a camera to photograph what they could see as they flew over the battlefield was in the fighting on the Marne and the Aisne in September of 1914. But those early months of the war, as we know from previous podcasts, were fluid months when the fighting was a fluid war of movement. The static war was yet to come, and the need for air photographs was probably fairly limited. But with the failure of the German Schlieffen Plan and the race to the sea, and the establishment of trench systems from the Belgian coast through Flanders, northern France, on into eastern France, right down to the border of Switzerland, the creation of that western front, 450 miles of trenches, really changed things forever, not just in the course of the war and warfare in France and Flanders, but in terms of the use of aerial photography. Because when that front went static, quite simply, it was a lot easier to photograph, because the front was not moving, the troops were not moving. And it was realised that as this network of trenches, this battlefield defences developed, they needed to be recorded, noted, mapped and understood. So as that trench system developed during the winter of 1914-15, in January 1915, the Air Photographic Section was founded as part of No. 1 Wing of the Royal Flying Corps. Aircraft were sent up with cameras to photograph what was taking place on the battlefield below. Cameras were quite bulky, they were handheld at times, which gave some quite shaky results. Later they were fixed to the side of the aircraft so that the observer in a two-seater plane could lean over the side of the aircraft, set up the camera and take photographs as they flew over the battlefield. And the negatives that were used in most of the cameras were glass negatives, which could easily break under the conditions of flying over the battlefield and being fired at by the enemy. And to get decent aerial images that were of any use to anybody, you had to fly relatively low. Many of the photographs were taken between, on average, 4,000 to 6,000 feet, but Cecil Lewis, who in his book Sagittarius Rising, describing his time on the Western Front as a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, said that at times they would drop to a few hundred feet to take photographs, which was incredibly risky from ground fire from rifles and machine guns, let alone anti-aircraft fire. But with these cameras and flying at that kind of height, they could produce incredibly detailed images that would reveal so much about the positions on the other side of no man's land. And the Battle of Neuve Chapelle in March of 1915 was the first battle where air photos were employed in the planning stage. And this, in terms of the static nature of the Western Front, was really the point in which the British Army's approach to the gathering of intelligence like this changed dramatically. But not just in the British Army. The French were doing the same, and the Germans on the other side of no man's land were photographing the battlefield as well. Stereo cameras were used by both sides, and in the Royal Flying Corps, a school of photography, mapping and reconnaissance was opened in 1916. This was all linked in as well, not just with the gathering of air photographs to be used to give you an idea of where the German trenches were. It was used as well to prepare maps. The British Army went to war with a series of maps in 1914 that were based on French and Belgian geographic information. So French and Belgian maps, basically, many of which it was proved were highly inaccurate. So in 1915, the British Army began its whole process of mapping the front, and mapping it with the assistance not just of ground survey, where they'd look to see where things were at ground level, but using air photos. And the photographs could then be used to produce and annotate highly detailed and accurate maps of the battlefield to assist those who would fight over it. As the war progressed, the number of photographs that were taken increased dramatically. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the Royal Flying Corps took 19,000 aerial photographs, from which more than 430,000 prints were made. So that means 19,000 individual images were taken, and then prints were developed from those that were distributed amongst the units on the ground to a staggering scale of nearly 500,000 prints sent out to units on the battlefield. And this shows that even by 1916, how important the role of such air photos were to the troops on the ground. And that only increased, so that by 1918, that figure of the production of air photographs rose to 5.2 million prints produced between January and September of 1918 alone. As we've said, the Royal Flying Corps weren't alone in having the technology to take air photographs. The French were doing the same from the very beginning of the war, and the German flying services as well. And the way they used those air photographs and the development of their use ran pretty much in parallel to the experience of the British and Commonwealth forces. The French were the first, to my knowledge, to publish the first proper manual to air photography. That was in 1916. And the Germans had gone to war with the advantage of high-quality Zeiss lenses on their cameras, which gave even greater definition to the photographs that they took. And they developed some really sophisticated stereo cameras, for example, which could be fitted to an aircraft, go up and take 250 continuous images in one flight. So that meant that by the end of the conflict in November of 1918, all sides had quite literally taken millions of aerial photographs. But how were they used? Who used them? And how were they interpreted? So what was the purpose of air photography in the Great War? Today, we see them as an important record of the landscape of the battlefields of the First World War, and we find them fascinating to look at. But then, what was their purpose? Once the war became static, it was clearly easier to photograph the enemy from above. But as the Western Front expanded, the importance to understand what and where the enemy positions were became even more important, because it wasn't a case of just digging one trench. Both sides were expanding on those trenches on a daily basis, and both sides needed to understand what was happening in those enemy positions, and aerial photography gave you a way to do that, so that you could send your aircraft up, you could use your balloons to take photographs, and you could see the enemy's development of his defences. But of course, both sides realised that they were photographing each other like this. If the Germans were up taking air photographs of British or French positions, then the French and the British were almost certainly doing the same of German positions. So the implementation of aerial photography, in some respects, changed trench warfare itself, because the men on the ground had to be mindful of the fact that the enemy was in the sky above them, photographing them. So they developed ways to disguise what they were doing and disguise what they were building. so as to hide from prying aerial eyes of the enemy what the true purpose of the construction they were working on was all about. So the implementation of these photographs really changed the way that both sides engineered their war, which is a fascinating thought in its own right. So who saw these air photographs? Well, they were used extensively at general headquarters of both sides to analyse the front, to understand the front and see where the enemy dispositions were located. And that meant that senior officers saw these photographs and staff officers saw these photographs on a regular basis. There are photographs taken within headquarters within the British and Commonwealth forces, for example, where you can see boards have been created where mosaics of air photographs have been cut and matched together to show a whole section of the front. So that meant that senior commanders and their staff who were running the battles on the Western Front saw this type of imagery daily, really. So they had a clear insight into what the front, what the ground level battlefield was like. So when I think of this, I think of that much alluded to episode during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, something very much pushed by Basil Liddell Hart, of a senior British commander, in this case Lieutenant General Lancelot Kigell, who is said to have stated when he went up to see the atrocious conditions on the battlefield during that 1917 fighting, "My God, did we really send men to fight in that?" Now that quote is a brilliant soundbite and was excellent to push Basil Liddell Hart's agenda as to how poorly the war had been fought, and it's a concept that's resonated amongst other historians down the ages. But the reality is that men like Kigell saw photographs of the battlefield, saw the reality of the conditions at Passchendaele day after day after day on air photographs. They could not escape it. So the idea that a senior officer would go up to the front line and say, "Good grief, I didn't know we fought in conditions like that," is really quite absurd. And it just shows how, using the evidence, the actual evidence of the Great War, we can dispel some of these myths about the wider aspects as to how the war was fought. But staff officers saw them, senior officers saw them, not just them. There weren't hundreds of thousands of staff officers looking at air photographs in the Battle of the Somme. You remember, over 430,000 prints were made during that period. So who were the key users? On the battlefield for much of the war, it was the artillery. On the British and Commonwealth side, the Royal Field Artillery and the Royal Garrison Artillery used air photographs on a regular basis to help with their work. It was realised quite early on that when the war went static and the guns would become important in that kind of static siege war, then the use of air photographs to, just as in the American Civil War with those shots from the balloon, to use air photographs to sight the guns, to train the guns on the target, was a really important factor in their success. So artillery units used air photographs to identify targets, to look at the ground that they were about to fire a bombardment onto, for example, and also to search for hostile artillery battery locations, because part of the artillery's role was not just to drop a barrage in front of an assaulting unit, or to defend a unit if it came under attack, or to harass the enemy in their trenches. Their job as well was to seek out the enemy's guns and destroy them, just as the enemy were trying to do the same to them. So the use of air photographs to fly up over the forward area of the battlefield to beyond it where the guns were located, because the field guns were not in the front line trenches, they were typically a couple of thousand yards behind those in valleys or in wooded areas or in other suitable locations to sight guns. Using aircraft to fly up and record what they could see with these cameras meant that the gunners could look at these air photographs, work out where the likely location of German gun sites were, and bombard them and hopefully silence the enemy's guns. Now, in its first use in those early years of the Western Front, that was quite a basic approach to doing it. Send an aircraft up, photograph a bit of a battlefield and send some speculative fire over. But as the war moved on, that became more and more sophisticated, and the ability to command flights by artillery units, so to ask for a flight to take place over a specific area. So they could put in a chit, so they could put in a request asking for a Royal Flying Corps squadron to fly up over an area of a map square or a couple of map squares, photograph some of the ground there, and then come back to base, have those prints developed from the glass negatives, and then dispatched by Donar, by dispatch riders to the artillery headquarters. So that ability to literally, on demand, ask for air photographs meant that the artillery could react more quickly and more effectively to conditions on the battlefield. And one of the veterans that I interviewed back in the 1980s and 90s was Malcolm Vivian. I've mentioned him quite a few times on this podcast. I interviewed quite a few gunners, but Malcolm was an officer and he went on to command a siege battery of the Royal Garrison Artillery. And being an officer, he had access to a lot more intelligence and information and therefore knowledge of what was going on around him. And also in his role as a FOO, a FOO, a Forward Observation Officer, he'd utilised aerial photography during his period, particularly at Arras in 1917. So he once described to me in great detail about how they would bunker bust, as he called it. So they'd use their 9.2-inch howitzers, which are pretty powerful howitzers used by the Royal Garrison Artillery, to knock out German concrete positions, whether observation posts or machine gun bunkers. And first they'd send the aircraft up to photograph the bit of the battlefield they were going to take on, to search out the key targets. They'd fire their guns based on the use of those aerial photographs to map where the bunkers were, use their own trench maps to map that as well, and then Malcolm would be on the ground at ground level observing with his signalling team, sending data back to the gun site to correct the fall of the shells as they dropped onto these targets. And then once they'd fired some salvos at these bunkers and appeared to have knocked them out, they'd then call for another flight from the Royal Flying Corps to fly over the same ground again and take some more photographs to see what damage they'd done. And if the damage was total and the target was destroyed, that's the end of the story, move on to the next bunker. But if the bunker was still there and was only partially damaged, they could then recalibrate the guns and drop the shells onto the target once more and hopefully this time destroy it. So we see quite a sophisticated approach here, really, of guns on the ground, eyes in the air with the Royal Flying Corps, and then eyes on the ground itself, Malcolm and his forward observation team directing the guns as the shots go in. So this combination of this different type of technology and the use of men and the use of the weapons meant that the British artillery in particular became a very effective part of the British and Commonwealth armed forces during the Great War. We've often said on this podcast how the artillery of all sides, were the king and queen of the battlefield, and its use, its sophisticated use like this, is really very much a part of that status. But it wasn't just the gunners that used the air photographs as well. The infantry had access to them, increasingly so as the war went on. And a good example of this is the Battle of Messines in June of 1917. Messines was a game-changing battle in so many ways, not just in terms of the explosion of the 19 mines along the Messines Ridge, destroying the enemy positions, helping to enable the infantry to make its advance. It wasn't just the mines at Messines that led to success, it was the artillery as well, and also the training of the troops involved. And it was the first battle in which everybody really clearly knew and understood what the task was before them. Models of the battlefield were constructed behind the lines, and every unit was taken there to be briefed on what their task was, what their brigade task was, what their division task was, and what the task was of the units that surrounded them. Now, in previous battles, this wasn't done. It was a citizen army, and the senior echelons of the regular army that still commanded were not sure that citizen soldiers, so not professional soldiers, could really understand this kind of stuff. But commanders like General Plumer, who commanded the forces at Messines in 1917, believed that the more a soldier knew and understood, the better he could perform as a soldier on the battlefield. And that training, by letting them into the plan, telling them what they were about to do, meant that in an attack, if their officers, who traditionally were the ones that were briefed on this, became casualties, then even ordinary soldiers would know what their task was and they could continue with it. And aerial photography is linked into this with the Battle of Messines because a huge number were taken in the lead up to the attack on the 7th of June 1917, and the prints were made and sent down to the different battalions that would take part in the assault. And what that meant at battalion level is that not just the battalion headquarters, the commanding officer and the adjutant and the second in command would see these air photographs and make decisions based on them. They would pass them down to the company commanders, so the captains or the majors in charge of an infantry company who were going to lead the assault, and within those companies, the platoon commanders, the subalterns, the lieutenants and second lieutenants, they would see them too. So again, going back to some of the veterans that I interviewed, men like Jimmy Lovegrove, Smiler Lovegrove, who was a platoon commander in the 2nd 4th South Lancashire Regiment, in fighting around the Houtolse Forest, for example, in 1917, he had air photographs showing the positions that he was about to take over with his platoon. So he wasn't just given a map to be demonstrated as to where he was moving up to take over a section of the front line. He was given aerial photographs so he could visualize the battlefield and see where his positions were. And this was really important when positions were quite complex, as they often were following a major battle. But at Messines, just going back to that, the use of them there meant that every soldier, right down to that platoon level, could see the ground over which they were going to assault, and they looked at those photographs and they memorized those photographs, and that important intelligence information was then gathered and used on the ground as they moved forward. So it meant that as they attacked an enemy, a German position, they weren't going to run into surprises. They weren't going in blind. It wasn't a case of over the top and the best of luck. And again, I think what this demonstrates is the sophisticated level over which the British and Commonwealth forces fought their battles as the war moved on. We tend to think of the war as being this static war, which it was quite literally, but also metaphorically, in that they fought the same types of battles again and again. Whistles blow, bayonets fixed, over the top, machine gun down in no man's land. But the war developed in all sorts of different ways: technology, the use of technology, tactics and the approach to battle. And air photographs weaves its way really through all of this, and the importance of understanding the battlefield and what you were about to attack or move over or take over was a really important aspect of the way the army developed its approach to battle. The types of photographs that the gunners and the infantry would see that would be given for their use in understanding the battlefield were two main types: the vertical photographs taken looking straight down onto the battlefield, what we'd see as the classic air photographs, and oblique aerial photographs as well, taken at an angle looking across an area of battlefield. Those were much more common, taken by the balloon sections of the Royal Flying Corps from static balloons, because you weren't looking down, the balloons weren't over enemy trenches, they were back from the battlefield, and they were taking shots looking across, often over the British and Commonwealth lines towards the German positions. The vertical photographs are the ones taken from aircraft flying up over the battlefield, over the German positions or wherever it was. And they were used in different ways. So the oblique photographs were probably of great use to infantry units because they could get a kind of a panoramic bird's eye view of the ground over which they were going to fight or which they were going to hold the line or whatever it was. And the vertical ones were very useful perhaps for the gunners like Malcolm Vivian, bunker busting at Arras in 1917, but also going back to the use of aerial photographs in mapping, they were especially useful for that. So both of these types of aerial photographs survive, and both of those types were used by all sides in the Great War. The detail on these photographs is really quite staggering. You can get modern prints from the Imperial War Museum, and they're pretty good quality, but at the time they were glass negatives, the vast majority of cameras that were used, and the negatives produced prints that were almost the same size as the negative, and that meant that the definition of those prints was very, very high indeed. And that's why when I purchased those German aerial photographs of Verdun, that through a magnifying glass I could quite clearly see human beings on there. Those French, you recall, marching down a road, or the sun shining off the top of a helmet of a soldier in a frontline position. So it meant that you could use these photographs because the definition was so good, so clear, so precise, that you could use them in the way that they did use them for these intelligence gathering processes. But how to understand them? The interpretation of these photographs was a developing science, really, during the Great War. There were no manuals of aerial photographic interpretation in 1914. While every side had cameras that could be taken into the air, the use of them in this way had not really been considered. As the war went on, everybody developed manuals to instruct their troops as to how to understand what these air photographs showed, because some people could look at them and they could see obvious details on them. Others looked at them and had no clue what these photographs showed. So the development, publication, and the expansion upon these manuals to understand how you interpreted the air photographs were an important part of the whole use of the photographs themselves. And the key things that the manuals and the associated courses that were developed during the war to teach people how to interpret photographs, the key things that they focused on was understanding features, understanding what you could see on these aerial photographs. Now, the crenellation of the trenches, that was one thing, but within those trenches there would be saps that were toilets, there would be saps that were machine gun positions, there would be saps that would be observation posts or trench mortar positions. How do you distinguish which is which? You can bombard the toilets and harass the enemy that way, but more effectively you want to destroy their machine guns, their eyes and their trench mortars. So the development of the ways to clearly understand what you were seeing on these photographs was really, really important. Light direction on the photographs was really important too, because light changes what you see in any kind of photograph. And when you know what direction the light is coming in for and the way it casts shadows, again, you can use that to understand what you're seeing. And that was something they didn't really realise straight away, but realised as the war progressed. And very often on air photographs, particularly in the latter stage of the war, the light direction is indicated so you can make a more informed assessment of what it is you can see on that photograph. Lining the aerial photographs up with the maps and vice versa was a really important thing. So on all British air photographs, particularly in the second half of the war, you see a north arrow actually marked on the air photograph. So a white straight line with a little cross across the top, like a compass point, indicating which direction was north. It's not always true north, I've found, but it was enough of a north indicator for them to match that up with the trench maps. And the idea was that you could get one of these photographs, particularly on the desolate landscape of Passchendaele, for example, where there weren't a lot of recognisable features. And if you knew the map reference location, and on British air photographs, they give part of the map reference location on there so you can match it up to a trench map. And with the north arrow on there, you can turn the air photograph around and then you can match it up with the map. This was the First World War version of GPS logging, I guess. It wasn't quite as accurate as that, obviously, but it gave the men using the photographs a better chance of understanding what it was and where it was in terms of their battlefield landscape. By 1917, and again with the Battle of Messines, you see a lot of this, air photographs were annotated at the base, so they were produced for units on the front line area, and intelligence staff would annotate them to clearly show the details that they thought were important. So I suspect that they thought we are highly intelligent, highly informed air photo experts, but the PBI on the ground, the poor bloody infantry, they probably won't know what this is. So the air photos were annotated, showing mortar positions, barbed wire positions, machine gun bunkers, and so on. And that's something that you see in quite a lot of aerial photographs of that period of the second half of the war. I've got one of the German positions at Spannbrookmolen on the Messines Ridge, for example, where it's a two-part photograph. One part is the photograph, the other part is the annotations. There are some annotations on the photograph itself, and that points out the observation posts, a trench railway system coming in, and so on. So it wasn't just taking a photograph, sending a print. As the war moved on, the sophisticated amount of information that was included in these images so that they could be used effectively on the battlefield just grew and grew. And I think that the use of intelligence in this way, aerial intelligence, shows how important air photographs were and how sophisticated intelligence was on both sides during the Great War. Both armies were not just blunt tools. And if you contrast 1914 with 1918 with the ability just to fly over a battlefield and then fly back to a headquarters and drop a message saying I've seen some German cavalry cantering down a road near Mons, compare that to 1918 when you could send flights up, photograph the movement of that cavalry column in some detail from an oblique angle, from a vertical angle, send that stuff back to headquarters. They would annotate it, indicate the directions, indicate what you were seeing, and then send that to soldiers on the front line for use on the battlefield. So it was really, I think, air photography on both sides was an important part of a commander's toolkit. And certainly the use of them by the British, extensive use of them by the British and Commonwealth forces, was part of the road, one of the many parts of the road to victory in 1918. So where can we find aerial photographs of the Great War, and how do they help us understand the old front line today? Having found those original aerial photographs back at a military affair in the 1980s, my initial thought was, well, where are they in the archives? Where are these photographs? And I happened to mention this to Rose Coombs, who then worked as the Special Collections Officer at the Imperial War Museum. She was the author of Before Endeavours Fade, the Bible to the Great War battlefields on the Western Front, a book that 3 decades after her death is still very much in print and still very much as useful as when it was first published in the 1970s. Rose put me on to Mike Willis at the Imperial War Museum. He then worked in the Department of Photographs, and he was their then resident expert, if you like, on aerial photography. And through them both, I discovered that the Imperial War Museum had this incredible collection, probably the largest in the world, in what was known as the box collection. The box collection were 150,000 glass negatives stored in their original wooden boxes, thus the name of the collection. And at that stage, they were still in their original envelopes, and on the envelopes it usually had the map reference, the key map reference of where that air photograph had been taken. And there was no proper index, so you couldn't say, let's have all the air photographs of Beaumont Hamel or Vimy Ridge or the Brunswinder Ridge or Ypres or whatever. You had to look up the trench map reference, submit the trench map reference, work out which potential photographs covered that area, and order them all. Now, what I discovered in doing this is there was often a lot of errors on the envelopes or on the boxes describing where these air photographs were. So once I ordered some photographs of what I thought was Givenchy-les-La Bassée on the La Bassée Canal, where the 1915 battles had unfolded, and in the end it transpired that they'd have been misreferenced in the description, and it was actually another Givenchy en Goël near Vimy Ridge. So there were a lot of problems in accessing them. Now these have, to my knowledge, all been digitised one way and another. A large number of them are on the Imperial War Museum photo website, and you can put in locations and it comes up with air photos. I don't believe it's every single one of them. So how you access the wider range of images that they've got, I don't really know, if I'm honest with you. I haven't done that for a long time. The 150,000 glass negatives only represent, if you excuse the pun, a snapshot of what the collection probably once was. I would guess that during the war, a lot of glass negatives were ditched, were lost, were damaged, and just left behind when the British Army left France and Flanders at the end of the First World War. So not everything was saved. And I remember at the time that the photographs that were in the box collection were those largely taken by the Royal Flying Corps. Now, when the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service were combined to become the Royal Air Force on the 1st of April 1918, they flew as the RAF in the last months of the war. There was a separate collection of aerial photographs taken by them, which was then held, and this is back in the 80s and early 90s, by the Ministry of Defence. Now, where they are now, and I thought that they were at the IWM Duxford in a separate storage, but they don't appear to be part of the online archive. If any members of staff from the Imperial War Museum do listen to this, I would love to hear more as to where that archive is. But whatever, to have 150,000 aerial photographs of what is largely the Western Front, I think there are some other theatres of war as well in there, but 150,000 images taken over the battlefield during the war, this is an incredible archive. And we'll look at some example of those in the final part of this podcast. The Western Front Association was also involved in a digitisation process for Imperial War Museum trench maps and air photographs, and as far as I'm aware they're still available via the WFA shop online, and these give you a good sample of the imagery that's available. I know about 10 years ago when we were doing a documentary about Messines following a dig that the archaeologist Simon Verdigam was working on, they proved extremely valuable for trying to get an insight into what the Messines battlefield looked like during the fighting there in June of 1917. And the McMaster University in Canada also has an excellent online collection free of charge to use of not just trench maps but air photographs as well. So there's quite a lot of online sources where you can go to find these air photographs to get an insight into what they can show you, what they can demonstrate about the history and the wider landscape of the Great War. And I'll put some links to some of these onto the podcast website so you can find your way to them. There's an extensive air photo collection in the French archives, and the Gallica website, which has got a huge amount of First World War imagery on it, has some leads to that as well. The German archive, to give us the German aerial insight into the Great War, is somewhat more problematic. I know that there's some aerial imagery in the Central German Military Archive, the Bundesarchive, but most archives relating to military units and formations in the Great War are scattered around the different former states of Germany. So going back to the 80s, when I was doing some work in the Württemberg archives in Stuttgart, they had a large collection of aerial photographs from the Württemberg units that served on the Somme front, for example, showing places like Hawthorne Ridge, Beaumont Hamel, the Ancre Valley, Thiepval, but they were in their archive. Now that particular archive, the Württemberg archive, is now online and you can look up aerial imagery on there, but not every state archive within Germany is. So it takes a lot more effort to try and find German aerial photographs from the period. You can also, of course, collect aerial photographs from the period, just as people collect trench maps. Some people collect air photos too. And a few years ago, I know the In Flanders Fields Museum were collecting aerial imagery showing the battlefields around Ypres, for example, for their archive. So they have their own collection of these images. Quite a number of them published in a fantastic, massive volume of air photographs that was published by them with an English edition in recent years. And again, I'll put a link to that book onto the podcast website because it is probably one of the best aerial photo books connected to the Great War. But like I say, you could actually collect them yourself. I've bought quite a few over the years. They're harder to find now, much more expensive. They do turn up on eBay. There used to be a great little photographic shop in North London in Islington that I used to go to, where the owner was a retired professional photographer, and he had an entire shop full of amazing photographs covering just about anything that you can think of. And they were stored in boxes, old Ilford photo paper boxes that were on shelves where he'd written on the end of it what the subject was. And I used to go in there in the early 90s and probably was one of the very few people that bought military images from him. So I got talking to him and he used to put things aside for me, and he'd always put air photos aside for me, and I picked up some really truly magnificent ones in there back at that time. But it's a lot more difficult now. And nothing that if you're researching a particular part of the battlefields that you really need to do yourself, because there are these phenomenal archives of World War I aerial imagery that you can consult. But what about using these air photos and using these air photo archives? What do they tell us about the landscape today? Well, I think that what you discover when you look at these images is the makeup of the battlefield, just like they did in the war. The reasons they used them was to see where the trenches were. And when you compare that to the landscape that we know now, you can get quite an accurate picture of what was where. So once you get to know an area and you walk that ground and you visit it, when you start to look at these air photos, you quickly begin to pick out things that you know. The layout of tracks and roads, the layout of fields and woods, all of it, very much of it, is the same as it was at the time of the Great War. When you look at a map of the Somme today, or the ground around Ypres, more so at Ypres there's been development, but generally speaking you can match up those landscapes very easily. And the air photos do more precisely than some of the maps, particularly the early war maps, which are not as accurate, show us exactly where these trench lines were, where a communication trench ran, where a front line position was, where a mortar position was, and so on. And I think that it also helps us understand the wider landscape. This podcast is very much about the landscape of, in particular, the Western Front and what it means to us today and how we react to it when we visit it. And this is another layer of it for me, the understanding of what the landscape was like more than 100 years ago through these aerial photographs. And it has a wider application with conflict archaeology. Archaeologists in Britain have been using pre-war and post-war aerial photographs of the British landscape to pick out medieval and Roman sites and explore those. And Great War aerial imagery does the same for modern conflict archaeologists who are examining bits of ground as well. It's all part of their toolkit to use these air images to get a greater understanding of what the archaeology will show them. In particular, I think for modern visitors to the battlefields, the oblique aerial photographs, so taken at an angle looking across a landscape, are particularly useful because we've stood on the high ground perhaps of the Ancre Valley, we've overlooked bits of the Messines Ridge, we've looked at the flat ground around Lewes and perhaps stood on an elevated position of Hill 70, or up on those coal slags of the Double Crassier close to Lens, looking out again across the Lewes landscape. All of these positions where we can get that kind of bird's eye view of the battlefield, the oblique images come into their own then because we can begin to match them up with what we know of the landscape today. And I think it's all part really of our wider understanding of the Great War. We often describe it as this huge jigsaw with millions of pieces which will never ever put together in a final moment. There will always be a new piece to find. And connecting the landscape of the past with the landscape of the present in this way is not just a fascinating and rewarding thing to do, it does give us that extra level of detail that we can't really find from anywhere else. And another aspect of this, of course, is modern technology. We have at our fingertips on the internet Google Maps and Google Earth, where we can explore these battlefields with modern aerial imagery. And quite a few other sites like the French IGN site, and there's a Belgian site as well where you can look at modern aerial photography taken at different periods of these battlefields. On the French IGN site you can go right back to the 50s in some cases and see the landscape of the Western Front over 60 years ago when there was a lot more remains of trenches and mine craters and other things. So we can connect all this up, and with the advent of the easy application of drones and the use of drones, although the use of drones on battlefields of the Western Front is much more restrictive than when I first used them in 2014, for example. Nevertheless, drone imagery, whether it's videos or stills, again adds another layer to our knowledge of the battlefields as they are today in the wider landscape of the Western Front. And just as the use of air photography in the Great War was an evolving science, the application of modern technology to scan a landscape, that is something that is changing and developing all the time. And I think there's probably a reason, a desire somewhere along the line to map that landscape of the Western Front using the evolving technology that we've got to create yet another level of understanding to our wider knowledge. So we've looked at the history and the application and the use of aerial imagery in the Great War. Let's have a look at some specific examples and we'll end the podcast with that. We'll finish the podcast with some examples of aerial photographs and look at what they show us in terms of the wartime detail and how that connects to the battlefields as we know them today. And the three examples that we're going to look at, one in Flanders, one on the Forgotten Front and one on the Somme, are all drawn from the Imperial War Museum archives, which are available online. And I'll put the actual photographs on the podcast website, so when we're talking about these, you can get them up on your screen and have a look at them. And then you can search, I'll put the link to them as well, so you can search for the actual images on the Imperial War Museum website. The first of these photographs is an oblique aerial photograph taken from the western side of the city of Ypres, looking right across the ruins of the shattered city itself. This is taken in about 1917 during the Third Battle of Ypres. We can see the level of destruction by this stage in the conflict. The buildings are ruinous everywhere. It has some sad echoes to events that are taking place on the other side of Europe right now. And there in the foreground we can see the mass of Ypres prison. This was one of the largest complexes in the city of Ypres. It was a pre-war prison for criminals, but it was taken over by the British Army and used as a medical facility. There was dressing stations in there, and it was also the headquarters of the town major of Ypres. Behind it was Ypres Prison Cemetery, as it was called then. You can see that in the photograph, and that today is Ypres Reservoir Cemetery. And then moving across to the middle of the city, we can see the distinctive buildings of St. Martin's Cathedral, and beyond it, the Cloth Hall. The tower of the Cloth Hall visible, some of the original walls, but the bulk of the building destroyed by artillery fire, and St. Martin's Cathedral just one big pile of rubble with part of the central tower emerging from the middle of it. Also, we see when we look at many of the streets within this photograph, clear entrances to the cellars and complexes and tunnels beneath the city that were utilised by the army. This is a daylight image, and to move around in daylight in Ypres was not a very healthy thing to do. Much of the movement was done at night. But in this photograph we can see some of those entrances to that troglodyte world that existed beneath the city of Ypres in Flanders during the Great War. And I think that when you visited Ypres and you've got a photograph like this and you wander these streets, you can see the rebuilt city of Ypres, the emerging phoenix from the ashes of destruction of the Great War, and then look at it as it was during the conflict itself. And I think, again, just wandering around the city with this photograph in your hands, it adds such a lot. And when we trace the route from beyond the Cloth Hall through the Grand Place, the main square, down the road towards what today is the location of the Menin Gate Memorial, we can see the gap in the ramparts there, the original Menin Gate, the route up to the front line, and just beyond it in the far corner of the photograph, the Menin Road bending and turning out towards the front line and close to Hellfire Corner. So what we've got here with this image of Ypres is not just an insight, a snapshot of the city as it was part-way through the war and the terrible destruction wrought by artillery fire. We've got a way to connect what it looked like more than a century ago to what we know of it today. I think that is the value of these things. Moving on to our second photograph, we're now on the Forgotten Front, that bit of ground between Flanders and the Somme, that bit of northern France where the lines remained static for so long, but where there were the occasional big battle, particularly in 1915, but also operations occasionally in 1916 as well. And this is an image taken by number 10 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps on the 9th of June 1916. A few weeks later, a British division, the 61st South Midland Division, and on its flanks the 5th Australian Division, would make an attack here against the German positions close to the village of Fromelles. Fromelles was the bloodiest Australian battle of the First World War. British troops fought alongside them in that action, and this aerial photograph shows the killing fields of those men from the South Midland Division who suffered such terrible losses here in July of 1916. What we see on this image is a very different landscape to Flanders, a very different landscape to the Somme and Arras. It's flat, it's very obviously flat on this photograph, and we can see the huge array of drainage ditches that crisscross this landscape. We can see that the trenches here are a mixture of trenches and breastworks, so positions built up above ground level, and they look different to the standard kind of trenches that you see on aerial photographs of other parts of the front. You can see the kind of built up parts of the crenellation of the trenches as they weave their way across the landscape. Up in the top right hand corner of the image we can see some positions behind the British lines close to Le Trou aid post, where a cemetery of that name exists today. And again, visiting this landscape, walking this landscape with this aerial photograph, you can take a track from Le Trou aid post across the fields out towards the Sugarloaf salient, and using this, see where the dispositions of both sets of trenches were and understand what a killing ground this was in 1916. Our final aerial photograph was taken by Number 4 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps on the 10th of October 1916, and it shows the German trenches in and around the Wye ravine at Beaumont Hamel on the Somme. The difference in the German trenches here compared to the ones we could see on the aerial photograph of the Sugarloaf salient is really apparent. You can see that these are constructed in a chalk landscape because the spoil of the chalk is very visible around some of the trenches, and the apparent depth of these trenches is really visible on this photograph when you look into how dark the trenches appear compared to others. The light has caught them perfectly and we can see them in quite high definition. In front of the German frontline positions, we can see what looks like a dark black scar running parallel to the trench itself, and this is the belts of barbed wire in front of their positions. And we're looking at a landscape where on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, a few months before this photograph was taken, unit after unit was destroyed here, including the Newfoundland Regiment in their attack on these positions on the 1st of July 1916. Just over a month after this photograph was taken, the 51st Highland Division, the Jocks, went through here and they took the Wye ravine. And when we look at this photograph again, we can see what a prominent feature it was. It shows depth and it shows positions in the side of it that the Germans utilised, and a communication trench coming out of one part of the Wye up towards the front line position. And of course this image takes on greater symbolism for us as modern battlefield visitors, because we can go to this landscape today. The trenches of the Sugarloaf salient have gone. Ypres has been rebuilt. In the previous two photographs, the landscape is very different. But here, this is a part of the Western Front that still exists. The trenches that we can see in this photograph are still there today. And that bit of communication trench coming up out of the Wye ravine is there, the frontline positions, and those who've been visiting the battlefields for some time might even have walked through these trenches when that was still possible. So again, visiting this place with this photograph in your hand adds a different dimension to our understanding of the landscape of the Great War. The view above the battlefields more than 100 years ago was important to the combatants on the ground. This was how they decided where to attack, when to attack, and the method by which they attacked. Today, that imagery gives us a unique insight into what those battlefields once looked like. It gives us an insight into the crater zones of Passchendaele, the chalk scars across the landscape of the Somme, and the flat ground around the Forgotten Front in northern France. It brings new understanding, new comprehension of the criss-cross paths, of that complex, of that fascinating landscape of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.